Welcome everyone. So today we're going to try and cover these areas. So we'll start with naming, dispossession, and displacement. Under the quote, "You were not here," we'll look at an extract from Edward Said's autobiography, Out of Place. And the symptoms of displacement, we'll look at another autobiography, I Saw Ramallah by al-Barghouthi. States of the refugee, we have the privilege of having a poet with us here in the room who's going to suggest a text to us and who's going to also discuss them with us. And the embodied memory or textual remembering will have a couple of segments. One is a poem by Darwish, and then a novel by a minor detail by Adania Shibli, who's going to be presented to us today and discussed with Ruth Abu Rashid, who's joining us online. Then close on Nation of Words. I will give you a quick view of an important research just published literally October of this year, and then end with a poem again. Is that all right? Okay, so you will have here a list that is by no means exhaustive, but these are different names or labels that are used to describe a Palestinian affected by exile and dispossession. And as I said, it's it's by no means exhaustive. And of course, there will also be other variations of it. The other issue with it is that it doesn't exactly translate, which means the Arabic names actually, some of them don't have equivalent. And that itself is important. So if we look at these, as when you have them there, but we have al-Manfi, al-Muhajir, al-Muhajir, and you can imagine because of the nature of Arabic, each one of these has actually a number of derivatives, the name of place, the name of the condition, the verbal noun, and so on. So there's a plethora of ways of actually describing this condition. So, but obviously, each one of them actually comes, as you can imagine, with its own baggage, primarily a legal one from a certain point of view. They're very different. They may actually intersect, but that's an important one. They also come with an emotional, a sociological, and political implications, each one of them. But what literature does, and they also could be local, apply to a certain community here, but not apply to another community there. So, but what literature does, I think, it makes this experience, which could be local, individual, or limited in time, shared across a community. In other words, it creates then this imaginary by which all of these are actually shared, but also shared by us, those of us who do not actually have not experienced any of these forms. So obviously, if you look at this labyrinth or maze of terms and you wanted to single out certain particular pieces of Palestinian literature, there are so many out there, literally it's impossible to cover. There are iconic pieces like, the poems Identity Card or Passport by Mahmoud Darwish. There is, for example, Safar by Ma'in Bsisu. There is obviously Liqarib fil Bahr, Barghouthi, and so on and so forth. So these iconic ones. We're staying a little bit away from those. But the whole seminar is going to be an attempt at entering some of these from the point of view of those who experience them, some of these states. So that is why I wanted to start, for example, taking into account the historical dimension with a piece that actually talks a little bit about 1947-48, but it also a piece that perhaps is well known across because it's written by a famous Palestinian, and this piece is by Edward Said. So I have a little extract from there that either can be read aloud, or if it's clear, we just have it there. If I have volunteers to read, I'll be happy to hand over for whoever wants to read it for us. and then we'll have a discussion about it. Is it okay? Can you see it clearly? Okay, all right, this is better than. Okay. Any initial thoughts? From a text called Out of Place, published in 1999. The first reference is obviously to Edward Said's own illness, and then he went back after that kind of incident of illness. But not the first time he went back. No, anyone wants to break the ice? Yes, go ahead, Bill.
Just one thing that jumps out at me is the question of naming. That seems quite particular. The kind of dislocation when you actually go to some place that you know, but it's being rebranded in a way.
That's going to be across, more or less, predominant in literature. This idea of naming places that you have names for them, they have different names, and you no longer can name them because even the name you carried is actually no longer has no reference anymore in that sense. So it has been emptied in a sense. But I was also intrigued by towards the end how there is the question of right of return and so on is a very dominant trope and also part of the major aim of anti-colonial struggle. And here we have someone who knows all about it, but also says he feels that he can't enter those places again. So should this be read as I don't want to return? Provocatively.
I think it's quite clear that there's a sense of identification with a lack. And the first term that comes to mind is, I think, a Japanese term called furusato, which is the longing for a lost home. And that within the context of the title suggests not just a physical displacement, but potentially an ideational one as well. A yearning for something that amounts to a home from which A is being displaced, but also feels a constant sense of displacement in the US as well.
Yeah.
From what I know.
No, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to move to the next extract because all of these texts actually speak to each other, and you'll see that, and the next one is a text by a poet, Murid al-Baghouti, very, very well-known Palestinian poet. And this is from I saw Ramallah. And to just contextualize this bit, this is the time of displacement, not the return to Ramallah. So a little bit like Said, but here described in more detail. And we're no longer in 1947-48, we are in 1967. And last week I talked about how these moments translate themselves into each other in time and in space. This is one example. I don't think this is clear enough. So is this clear for you in the back there? Okay, great. So let's try to read it a little bit.
What's the name of the book?
I saw Ramallah. I'm going to move to the second page of it, or half a page, because it's actually in two parts. Okay. As you think a little bit about it, I just refer back to this legal maze and labyrinth I mentioned at the beginning. And here is an explanation of one particular state of being, this nezah, nuzuh, this displaced, and what kinds of things that needs to be done. So that's on one level. The other level is trying to sort of work with what something we mentioned before as well, which is idea of inventory of this is what a nezah not only needs to do or must do in terms of legal, but also the emotional state and how he feels inside, so to speak. No? And part of that, and I was really struck by this, is this towards in this particular part where there are levels of, instead of visibilizing his condition, is actually purposefully screening it, concealing it, invisibilizing it. That's a little bit unexpected, but from this condition, it's probably understood. And another thing that he brings here that perhaps Said doesn't bring directly, which is the question of time, the time of the displaced and how they inhabit time, or time inhabits them. So that is by way of opening the discussion. And people who are not with us, please raise your hand, and we'll just, rather than chat, it's better we have room to talk to each other. But not everybody has access to reading your chats. Joe?
I was struck in the Said, the first one, swept out of the place, and then the title of the book being Out of Place. So this kind of the loss of the article is felt quite strongly. Whereas in this one, it's strange to see how the spatial and the temporal overlap a lot more. I'm quite interested in that idea of living in the silent spot within himself. Because at least in English, that word spot is ambiguous. It can be a place, but it could also be a kind of a stain or something kept hidden for different reasons. So ambiguity in relation to place in both of them is a strong.
To understand also the beginning, this is so he heard this news, and there's a reference to the radio station, which was a very important thing in 1967 war, where everything comes through Radio Cairo, and he was actually in Cairo taking his exams when he heard this. That's why we have reference that I have no walls to hang these certificates, and can't go home and so on. So that's in a sense how it started. He will end up marrying an Egyptian, actually, very famous novelist called Radwa Ashur. I wanted to return this question of time, and a lot of people who deal with diaspora and exile studies and so on talk about this idea of experience of not only of different times, but also of the certain times or places are actually frozen in time. So this will be the idea of the home, in a sense, frozen in time. So the idea of return, and Said, in a sense, perhaps is saying that, he wished it was actually frozen in time, so you come back and find it in that particular state, in that sense. So that creates all sorts of tensions with Ho, or more generally, between diaspora community and a community that stayed and didn't leave. And this is actually a real fact, and also has political implications, questions of legitimacy. Why did you leave? Who actually more legitimate, and so on. I think this is important to note, that it creates that, and that is actually part of the life of a community that has been split. So the most important part is that not all this community was displaced. Part of it was displaced, and others were displaced internally. Some were not displaced, and some of them were displaced. So that community itself is kind of looking for a time that unites it, all of it. And that time is in a really non-existent, or may exist in a common hope or a common future or a common struggle, but there's no common lived past. They actually live in the time of New York that Said lives is not the time of someone in a refugee camp in Lebanon lives. So these are different temporal experiences, and they are bodily experiences too, in that sense. And we'll come to discuss the body a little bit more in the next segments, but the body also is important in this. Neither of these constituencies can actually experience what the other body experiences. You're not going through the checkpoints, you're not asked the same questions, in that kind of existence, so to speak. Any comments on this text before we move to another location? Yes, please.
I think there was a sentence in the first page when he said that we always think that this place would have been to other people. And I think that's very, very true for many people who experience this, because we see the others being on the move, but we wouldn't imagine that that turn would happen to us at the same time.
Right. Which kind of reminds us of other things, major things that happen to others, and we don't think they happen to us, including the ultimate end of life, so to speak. You always think it happens to others, doesn't happen to you. In a sense, there may be something there going on. It is almost like a death experience or a near-death experience that you think is remote, and it doesn't happen to you, but it does. There's a reference to fear, which I thought was interesting as well, but I'll just mention it. Is this question is, he may not rejoice in what makes them happy, people around you, so to speak, in the diaspora, but he's always afraid when they are afraid. I don't know what you made of that. He's afraid when the community in which he lives, or happen to be in Berlin or in Egypt or whatever, is afraid. He shares the fear, their fear, but not their happiness. Is that? I found that a bit intriguing.
I read that when they were afraid, he was more at risk. He fears their fear because he is the person identified as the person causing their fear, and therefore that's what makes him afraid.
Yeah.
But he's a foreigner and can't, as he says explicitly, takes no interest in their details. So what makes them happy has no bearing.
And he probably prefaced it by talking about feeling to be always the infiltrator. And the infiltrator comes with a risk, with the security warning, the term infiltrator. So this is the segment we're all waiting for. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have with us Yusuf Qasmiya, who has published so far, probably there are others, at least in the creative field, these two collections of poems, and we selected a number of them for you to read. They're in the shared file, but there are two. One from each collection that we wanted to start with. So this is the first one. Yusuf, do you want to read it, or I think you're the poet? You can read it from the book. We don't have that privilege, but I heard the books are in the library actually.
Once I asked my mother, "Mother, in the absence of a place, who invites who?" She looked at me and said with a concerned tone of voice, "My son has gone mad. Hurry, hurry up. Summon the Imam to recite over him." It is the tremor in the hand that invites. My grandmother in Nahr al-Barid camp used to squeeze our little hands whenever we appeared at her doorstep and say, "How did you leave the camp?" We never answered. In intention, the prevalent tense is the past. We never listened to my mother and always insisted on swallowing the chewing gum, thinking that it might one day become a balloon that would transfer us to God. Is the memory of the camp not the camp? Suddenly, our senile neighbor stuffed her memories in a plastic bag and left. In the bomb shelter in Baghdadi camp, in complete darkness, my mother, to ensure we were by her side, would count us, not knowing that most of the time, the children she was tapping and uttering the number of belonged to other families. The man whose sister is also my sister once asked me, who is older, God or the camp? The camp has its own sky. When people shoot in the air in happiness and in despair, it is to kill the bird that is never there. My father, who has persisted in writing since a young age, has not published a single thing. In his beige room, with eyes trying to see, he showed me one of the magazines with a poem of his that bore somebody else's name. We look at it to see what it is that is not ill.
Thank you. Okay, do you have any questions, comments, things you're eager to know about this poem? Since we have at least one voice, one interpretation of this poem is with us. Not necessarily the most authoritative one.
And I'm not so sure that
I'll start with a question, Yusuf, and that's the very end of the poem about the father who never wrote and the son who can't stop writing.
But in fact, the father did write. This is, and he passed away 3 years ago. And my sister in Sweden, because we're all over the place now, we're scattered across mainly Scandinavia and North America, and I'm based in the UK, and the rest are in 3 different refugee camps in Lebanon. My sister in Sweden is the one who owns his drafts. And mainly because I'm sure that you know, Professor Omri, that every political faction, in fact, has its own magazine. And my father would, in fact, join a particular political faction mainly in order to publish, not in order to commit politically. So, and what's very, very sad is that he's never had the opportunity to publish in his own name. What's happened, and these are all, in fact, things that can be easily substantiated, is that people would appropriate his draft poems and publish them in their names. So it is back to also, my father would normally show us these drafts and say that these are written. Of course, we would know that these were written by him. But to be happy about something appearing, something emerging out of this house in a camp, and to be inscribed on a piece of paper and to say that these are my words. Yes, of course, the name isn't mine. And yet still, this is a huge achievement within that context.
Yeah, so yeah, I was specifically leading to that idea of inscribing, of leaving a trace and a testimony. In the end, your poem here is a testimony to him writing or not writing, and it inscribes him. But this is intriguing, this question of dislocation between him as a writer and as a name on the page, which is another form of dislocation, another name, another place where the name and the thing don't really match in that sense. But I'll leave the others here in the audience if they have any questions or comments on or even praise is fine too. Because I found some lines really, really brilliant here.
Somebody has their hand up actually.
Someone has hand up. Ruth.
Hi, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'd just like to thank the poet for this poem, because you know, for someone who's lived in a camp, you know, outside the area, it's I think everyone who reads it, who has lived in a camp, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Jordan, whether it's Lebanon or elsewhere, would that it's like what you said, it's that experience of one person, you feel that it's shared by many. And I think it's I think many people have got fathers and mothers who didn't write, but whose memories are there in other traces, and your poem does justice and testimony to them all. So thank you.
Thank you. I just note this senile neighbor who stuffed her memories in plastic bag and left. Very provocative, the whole thing.
And I also, in fact, I've written about the very same neighbor in more detail in a piece titled Being Palestinian. Because this neighbor, like my father, they shared Haifa as the point of reference. And this woman arrived as a teenager, and she didn't recover from that. In fact, forced expulsion. So she always said to people, please take me back to Haifa. And she would assume, in fact, that Haifa, back to Said's notion of this outness, because it's translated into Kharij in Arabic. She would assume that Haifa is, in fact, simply outside camp.
this proximity that never left her mind, is also translated in the proximity of space. Okay, if we still have one more poem at least to look at with Yusuf, and it's this poem. It's from
this book mainly, I would say, it grapples with aid and through rations, the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, and this conditional or these conditional offers as well, about mainly the rations, in fact, cooperate our presence as refugees, because we have to be contingent, to be reliant on them to survive. Offers to eat the UN flower, to swallow what comes your way, the nod of the lack of what it is that is being gifted, from tins to thoughts, from roofs susceptible to fall, to concrete grounds flattened in haste, the flower equally half between us and insects roaming the place, to suspect as you look at what lingers on the plastic mats, where meals and the quarrels are had between hungry mouths, that the cooked equates to the edible, and that the things necessarily made of what is left of the leftovers are ours in the first place, the eternal gift. There, history dictates kissing the hand, a white, clean hand stretching out from one time to another, feeding, cutting, wreaking havoc on the imagination, as the pot bubbles over on our makeshift fire, made of everything new and old, from half-full notebooks signed with donors' names, to sticks and the twigs collected from all grey corners, flower to repel our sight, as my mother would say, the dough as a war, the baked as fire, for the blasphemous. We sit as norms dictate, munching away at the scraps of tomorrow.
Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you. Yes.
I'm really interested in that idea that aid produces what counts as a refugee in the first place. And also in the first poem, there was counting. There's the counting of children in the dark. And counting's been really prominent in the news. Different ways in which children are counted have been very present. And I'm just interested in those different kinds of counting, actually, whether that's something that you think about a lot.
Yes, but it's so in my again back to Badawi camp, in my home camp, as a family we were registered as, and this is really something fascinating, our also proximity to the English language through these acronyms, because we come across the acronym and then the acronym becomes Arabic. So UNRWA is written just as an individual entity, as one word. So you don't see these separate individual sounds. You see them as just one unit, collapsing into just one body. And this is in fact how we came across the English language. And this is how we would see English letters. And then of course, you assume that these are fully sort of bodied words, not just acronyms and initials. With reference to counting, 1 out of 11. So just to contextualize the bomb shelter. And the bomb shelter, in fact, Malja, and the term for refugee, laje, they are cognates. So this is something that is concealed in the English language. So for us, we belong to the shelter. For us, we seek refuge in this place and in the camp. And so to be able to count, remember, in the dark, we spent 70 plus days in the bomb shelter. And I used to swap, in fact, the chewing gum with my sister, something that we kept for 30 days, just simply to chew it. Tasteless, and yet, of course, it was extraordinary for us, mainly to beg the older sister to simply let go so we would chew something. And Britain would give, of course, us tinned each other. So much so that we started using the verb shaddarna, as in we had enough, simply. And that was, remember, when Britain simply gifting Israel all these high-tech missiles. So we need to also think about counting, but also we are pending victims, and also even, again, our death is imminent. This is how we view ourselves even as children, that we're going to die. And it's not about normalizing death, because we had a cancer patient in this bomb shelter and she died. And we had the dead body amongst us for over 20 days. So just think about this. So it's like, so counting, we count everything, including the chewing gum, the chewed and the much chewed chewing.
I was tempted to see that line, the first line, to eat the UN. Stop there, as in to eat the UN flower.
Yeah.
And to eat the UN in reflection of the title of the piece, Eating the Archive. So I wonder if you can tell us more about eating the archive.
In fact, the title itself is something that that belongs, I would say, in equal measure to myself, but also to my dear friend, a brilliant Trinidadian poet, Vani Anthony Capildillo, because I made her, or I made them, in fact, lentil, the way we cook the lentils. And they asked about the source of the lentils. She couldn't believe that these lentils were gifted by my mother. And in fact, these are UN lentils cooked in Oxford, because according to my mother, we don't eat very well here. So she wanted, and this is that, and that's why we spoke a lot about how eating has to do also with preserving, the way we dry vegetables in order to resuscitate them at a later date. And this is archival. It's about really putting something away and then returning to it. And so that was the idea behind eating, not only to swallow and then ingest and then of course to dispose of, but to preserve and conserve without, yeah.
Thank you. Any comments or questions from here or online? One more for me. The flower to repel our sight, as my mother would say. And I wanted to expand that a little bit, because you're a native speaker of Arabic and you work really well with that, and you decide to write in English. So there, in writing that, I can read, obviously, you're transferring a proverb or a saying or an idiom. First of all, I wanted to know what it is in Arabic, and then the wider question of writing in English or inscribing the camp in English. And
first of all, I do not think that I write fully in English. And this is, it is not only thematically, but also with reference to my understanding of the English language and how Arabic, in fact, is being perhaps rewritten, I would say, afresh into English. With reference to this, it's to this, I call it mainly super idiom. It's not just an idiom. Mainly when my mother would simply say, as in, do not look at what other people have. Just be content with the rations that we receive. And I, in the English language, what I did was to rewrite, in fact, my mother's words. And so there is a degree of, I would say, of forgery here, because the metaphor belongs to my mother. And I did write, in fact, in a separate piece about co-seeing with my mother, because my mother is illiterate, and yet I steal a lot of her metaphors. So when I speak with her, I feel the need to register and to archive her words. And then what I do is simply to write them into perhaps poetry. And once I told her that you feature in these poems, and she simply said that we do hope that that we feature in a good way, as if people are not going to assume that we're really miserable, as in we're fine in a camp.
Yeah, we discussed last time the transgenerational memory and how things move from another. And here we have a very good example from father to son in terms of writing and so on, and from mother to son as well. There is this one step further, not only transgenerational memory, but actually inscribing the memory of another generation and the current generation. Thank you very much, Yusuf.
Can I ask one question?
Yes, please.
It's about chewing gum. So you mentioned when you were in the refuge, in the shelter for, I think you said 20 days, you tried to sustain a piece of chewing gum with your sister for 20 days. In the first form, you talk about swallowing them. So
Outside the camp,
Outside the
outside
camp.
the shelter,
Okay.
outside the. And because back to eating the archive, also not to let go, not to let go. Normally you would wake up and you'll find the chewing gum stuck to your head. This is exactly, but also to say to yourself that you did consume something.
Thank you. I'm going to move to next poem is by Mahmoud Darwish, and I have a translation in English here, so I could leave that there, and then I read it in Arabic. And I have this poem for two reasons. One of them that it returns to naming the exile in a number of ways that are running through, and the other one is it works with one particular metaphor that I will explain a little bit as a transition also to our next text. So the poem we have is by Darwish. I'll just go to English because I've got the Arabic in front of me. So while you look at that, I'll just read it in Arabic for you. أنا هو يمشي علي وأسأله هل تذكرت شيئا هنا؟ خفف الوطأ عند التذكر فالأرض حبلى بنا. قال إني رأيت هنا قمرا ساطعا ناصع الحزن كالبرتقالة في الليل يرشدنا في البراري إلى طرق التيه لولاه لم تلتقي الأمهات بأطفالهن ولولاه لم يقرأ السائرون على الليل أسماءهم فجأة لاجئين ضيوفا على الريح كان جناحي صغيرا على الريح عامئذ كنت أحسب أن المكان يعرف بالأمهات ورائحة المريمية لا أحد قال لي إن هذا المكان يسمى بلادا وإن وراء البلاد حدودا وأن وراء الحدود مكانا يسمى شتاتا ومنفى لنا. لم أكن بعد في حاجة للهوية، لكنهم هؤلاء الذين يجيئوننا فوق دبابة ينقلون المكان على الشاحنات إلى جهة خاطفة. المكان هو العاطفة. تلك آثارنا مثل وشم يد في معلقة الشاعر الجاهلي، تمر بنا ونمر بها قالبا كنته يوم لم أعرف المفردات لأعرف أسماء جارنا وأسمي الطيور التي تتجمع في بأسمائها. لم أكن أحفظ الكلمات لأحمي المكان من الانتقال إلى اسم غريب يسيجه الأوكاليبتوس، واللافتات تقول لنا لم تكونوا هنا. I can move back between slides if you need to. The relevant ones for you. Okay. So just yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Eucalyptus presumably is also as a strange alien plant, right? Contrasting with the Mariamia
being
sage and
being local.
A local plant.
And the smell of it takes you to home in that sense.
As the eucalyptus does for me as a stranger.
Yes, actually, yeah. Thank you. There's also a naming of various ways of being an exile or diaspora. There's talks about Al-Manfa, and actually use some of the names I used at the beginning, Laji'in, refugees, and so on, and then talks, presumably here is from the point of view of a child who has not grown up yet to understand the question of identity or questions of space, and nobody told him about this, so he's in a sense unprepared. What intrigued me is that the invading force that he's talking about actually displaces place. He says ينقلون المكان على الشاحنات. They take the space and they actually move the space. So even that idea of space is actually itself that's transferable and subject to itself being exiled and so on. But also this idea, this metaphor of guests, in Arabic it's ضيوفا على الريح. He calls the refugees guests on the wind. I don't know what that section is. I think it's the beginning here. Or guests of the wind in that sense, that instability, that not being anchored anywhere, and that was.
And the same, in fact, image used to describe Salim Barakat in his poem as well. The Kurd.
Yeah, the Kurd. Yeah. Another displaced people.
In the sense that place is a feeling as well. Again, that attempt to kind of locate something materially, but actually, it seems to always be escaping, but nevertheless, it is present in a different way.
And to echo back with Said, or Said's trip, couldn't find things. That end that talks about the signs say to us, you were not here. Signs that are reinforcing this absence, and that could be change names like Said is talking about, for example, names, places, and so on. Any comments or thoughts on this? Because before I go to this reference that he has about the tattoo that some of you might find intriguing. So I go back to it because I think there's a lot to that one. previous page.
Oh,
it's at the top. Okay. Yeah, it's that one over there. So what's the story of this? First of all, those who know classical Arabic literature, they will know that this is an intertext, is a reference to something. And it's a reference specifically to the opening of the pre-Islamic major poems, mu'allaqa. And they all start in a similar way, but I'll just show you an example, and then I'll say a little bit more about it. So a famous one where this quote comes directly from is the mu'allaqa of the pre-Islamic poet Tarafa. And in Arabic it says, لِخَوْلَةَ أَطْلَالٌ بِبَرْقَةَ تَهْمَدِي تَلُوحُ كَبَاقِ الْوَشْمِ فِي ظَاهِرِ الْيَدِ. And every child, I think, knows this poem. And that's a translation by Michael Sells in his sort of poetic translation of these as desert tracings, is what he called them, which I thought was a very evocative title by Michael Sells. Now, this question, this line starts almost every mu'allaqa, every poem. So every poem physically basically starts with this idea. The idea is that the poet comes to a camp looking for his beloved and doesn't find her. He finds only traces or ruins, or something indicates that they were there. Then he starts his journey. Of course, he starts then reminiscent about their love and what they lost and so on. And then he starts his journey, it's always his for these poets, looking for her. And that's usually through the desert, is going to be the trails and travails and the wars and everything going to recover. And obviously boasting about himself as a warrior, as a knight, as a poet, about his tribe, until in an attempt to recover, turn the traces into an actual sign of life and recover and meet her, and then trying to whatever, reunite with her in whatever way. Now this is at the level of the story or the epic of this story. At the other level, there is quite a bit said about, actually, it's within the process of uncovering traces and ruins that the poem is constructed. The whole poem is actually a construction based on recovering these traces. So in it, you inscribe the discussion of the tribe, in it you talk about pride, and you talk about the wars and the riches and everything. But at the same time, you're actually constructing this poem. So the idea of washm is something that is there and is not going to disappear. So in the desert, it's hidden by the sand and so on, but in the hand, it's there. So it's tattooed. And you can begin to see why, under this metaphor, you can actually study this, all of this literature I've been discussing, or the Palestinian diaspora literature. A lot of it is actually following the traces in the ruins. And you can link that to things like, the villages that disappeared, or the families that are gone, or the stories or the memories that need uncovering. So in that sense, for you, they're engraved in your memory like a tattoo. So they're both bodily, but also mentally, mental images, and you need to preserve them and recover them. And Mahmoud Darwish uses that allusion to sort of work with the idea of active, not only remembering, but actually inscribing the memory of the traces. We discussed at the very beginning the idea of textual rescue, of how when in situations of partition or dispersion or so on, then the text or the literature is there to rescue the spaces, the memory, and so on. It's in a form textually. And obviously, this is done across. So I'm saying all this because the next basically text that Ruth is going to present to us is an example, I think, to a certain level of this form of rescue literature.
You can see. So hello everyone, my name is Ruth Abu Rashid. I'm a lecturer in Arabic cultural studies at the University of Manchester. I specialize in translation studies, particularly how exilic literatures move across different languages, particularly from Arabic into English. So my book is about Iraqi and women writers that have moved across languages, partly because at the time when I was writing it, conceptualizing it, I was actually living in Syria at the time, in the Palestinian area, and it was something in the situations of exile they were writing about in Iraq had some resonance to, I suppose, the situation that was experienced by many Palestinians and Syrians at that time. So, and I also worked for a time on the Pell Reef project, which I think you're going to be talking about later, Mohamed-Salah, as one of the researchers there. So I was really drawn to the idea of a minor detail, or tafsil al-thanwi, or eine Nebensache, as it is in German, partly because it's an amazing story, and it talks about the idea of displacement of the Ghaib al-Hadir, and the idea that you have to look for traces in unexpected places. And then, of course, there was the issue of the whole, what happened when the German the German version of it was going to be honoured. I'll come to that in a minute. But to explain briefly what the novel is about, it's in two parts. And it's about a reconstruction of an atrocity that happened in 1949, the gang rape and killing of a Palestinian girl in Nirim, in south of Palestine in 1949. And the details of this atrocity was recorded in a very matter-of-fact way in a military diary dated August 1949 by Israeli battalion commander located in Nirim. And what this is, the first part is the writer Adania. She writes about this in the third person, about the experience of the Israeli battalion commander. And then in real life, what's happened is that this incident is not something from her memory. It's something which has been brought to trial, something that did happen, and it's part of Israeli collective memory, and it's been brought up twice in an Israeli military court. The first trial shortly after 1949, it was a secret trial, and then again it was brought up in after the 1956 massacre of at least 43 Palestinians in Kafr Qasim. The outcome being that soldiers should not be carrying out illegal acts, even if a commander of a battalion says that they can. That's the outshot of this. So what's happening just here, I'm just trying to get it to move. Sorry, just try this again. And the copy of this 1949 entry is obtained by Haaretz newspaper, which is a newspaper in Israel it's published in Hebrew. There's versions in English and probably in Arabic, and it was published in 2003. The second part of this novel is a fictive account of one Palestinian woman's experience reading about this event in an Israeli newspaper, and what incited her to trace what happened to that Palestinian girl in 1949. And the action being, as we'll find out in the reading, it's just a coincidence of dates. She then journeys by car to Nirim to find these archives with a Palestinian friend's ID card. Explain more in the reading. And then it's an account of the borders of thought and care for the missing Palestine. What her journey, what it tells us, it tells about many differing and shared borders and exile displacement for Palestinians in different times and places. Now, if you Google about Adania Shibli, you will see that actually they don't write much about the story at all, but you can see here, I'll leave you to read. She's known for this translation, have a minor detail into English, German, and other languages, and for this controversy, due to the cancellation of a literary prize for this book, originally scheduled for the book fair. So you can see already in English, in German, the paratext or the paratranslation of it, it's not obviating the Arabic story. It's about what happened, about the reception of the story in English and in German. I'm not going to labour the point too much on this, but it's just so you know why it's become such an important issue. Basically, what happened was the prize giving was going to happen, I think on the 7th, the 8th of October, which coincided with current events in Gaza. And it was postponed, supposedly with the agreement of Adania. Adania had no idea, she states, that it was going to be postponed at all. And a lot of German critics then talked about it, saying that the novel was prize-worthy or meriting its prize, and rightly celebrated as a masterpiece. And she was stating that just because of the murders of the current murders, mass murders of Hamas, had nothing to do with serious literary criticism. It's been taken, this was not what this book should be known for. However, you can see here some of why perhaps she was cancelled, because another critic said that the novel opened space for anti-Israelische and antisemitische Narrative. You can see here the translation. And then he also said what happens at the end of the novel reduces it to a unilateral piece of propaganda. So I'll go into this in a minute. So you'll see why it's something to do with what happens to the Palestinian researcher when she tries to search for the evidences of what happened to the Palestinian girl in 1949, what happens to her when she finds herself in an unexpected time and location in near Nirim. So one important thing to realize was at the time is here, what I'll say is that it's important to know that this has already been written about what happened here. The final, so this is back into 20 years ago. And I would say those of us who were in the UK or reading the guide in 2003, you will see somehow that this was not talked about in the media. But I'll leave you just to read this. I think to me, the reason why I brought up this, this shared with you now is really the final sentence. Several years later, members of Kibbutz and Nirim base noticed that a wind had uncovered a small hand. I presume that was something, there was someone who has been buried there. And it's only really the wind, the nature, that has actually testified to something which otherwise would have remained hidden. So what this novel focuses on is that as this writer, this researcher tries to find out more about what happens, she finds that there are only very unexpected traces that remain to testify. Or what you mentioned before, Mohamed-Salah, about rescuing hidden tragedies and gaps in knowledge, also hidden gaps in imagination. And her question is, how can we recover or rescue partial fragments which perhaps are only known or meaningful by the context? Perhaps this novel, I would say, I argued was one trace, but how can we find details of a history or an event whose occurrence is perhaps only testified to by nature, not by humans? And who of the exiled or the displaced, or al-ghaibin al-hadirin, can search for traces of their country's past, and where can they go? So the novel testifies to the importance of unexpected traces when gaps in knowledge have been purposely created, where the imagination has been bound and constrained for purposely reason. So it says, there is no answer. But as I said, this novel is one trace. For example, we can instantly grasp, those of us here watching this on screen, or those of you sitting at the university, we can instantly grasp why the boy in Gaza was so happy. And this was actually not from a recent bombing. This was from a bombing that happened 2 years ago, to find this goldfish in the rubble of his house. He was so happy to find his house was completely destroyed, but I found a goldfish and my goldfish is alive. We can feel why he is so happy because we know this context. But what about, this is something we can recognize, but what about the only non-humanly recognizable trace of a person or an event, such as detail of the wind exposing a little hand? So the ending, for those of you who haven't read the
maybe you should let them read the novel.
Not-
Actually, move just to, we have time only for one extra. We have
to say the novel, yes, yes, yeah. So just to say, just read the end of it, the novel, and just ask what else could have happened. So just like you just to have, this is a part that happens, I suppose, in the first part of the second part of the novel, where she's just come across this incident in the paper, and how you can see here. Just want you just to read through this part here. And what I notice about it, it documents how the horrific is completely normalized where she lives in Palestine, 1948 territories, how readers of news will become desensitized, and how the connection of care, how it emerges. So you can see here, there's nothing unusual about the fact a bombing happens, and it's, you see, as an everyday person, she does not say she wants to be a hero. She wants to say, I've never been preoccupied with incidents like these before. Even this incident in which, according to the article, several people were killed. It was only because of a detail of one of the victims. And it's not even, the unusual thing is perhaps that it was a gang rape, but that it happened on a morning that would coincide exactly 25 years later with the morning I was born. That is it.
Thank you.
So the question is,
Okay.
how does it compare?
So thank you very much for this thorough view of it and the novelist context. I hope this will make people read this book. All right. Let's see if there are any reactions. If you have a couple more segments to go through. So if people have any thoughts about this or things you want to know more, or I mean, presumably there is a building to the whole reconstruction of what happened through this particular case. And in fact, I was struck by the image of the Arabic novel. It looks very much like the poem I just quoted, the first line. It's really sand and something appearing and things like that when you go and trace. So it's almost an application of that particular line of poetry, which is itself is at least 1600 years old.
I'll just move to the next page, and then perhaps here, because it's just really, this shows you really a testimony. The conversation that happens here is an archive of location. The borders of exile, how Palestinians are exiled from their own memories, their own knowledge, that has actually been recorded and acted on and hidden elsewhere. So those of you who can read the Arabic the Arabic font is bigger and the English font is very small. So what you're seeing on the left in the English is actually the full translation of what you see on the right in Arabic.
If you don't mind also giving us the presentation to add to the shared folder where we put everything for people to consult, so we could do that and people can continue reading it at their own pace.
Yeah. So that it was talking about is the idea, the exile from knowledge who has access to these archives, because as we saw from the Guardian article, this article was found, it was shared, but the difference is that would be us reading it in online format, paper format, perhaps at the time, 2003. And this is her reading it in an article. And you can see here, it's Israeli journalist. And then you can see that she's having to even try and disguise. You said something about trying to screen who you were. This is interesting. You said that. I tried to pass an intahal shakhsiyya واثقة من deliberate word choice.
Yeah, word choice. So pretending something you're not. Okay. Well, I'm going to actually thank you, Ruth. I'm going to move. Maybe we can. I can have the other presentation on to return back to the screen. Okay. Hold on. So we can return to that. What should I do? Share my screen here? Yes. Go back to share my screen. This one. Yeah, we were here actually with that. We were in this place. Okay. See, we had the cover. And we have the sections. So what I wanted to mention, and Ruth alluded to this, but before that, I mean, we can begin now to see that basically, as Yusuf was also saying, there is really an attempt to write and write and write and write. And there's so much written by Palestinian diaspora in all sorts of languages too. That itself was the project by someone who's now based in Germany with a large team called Country of Words. And what they did is they produced what is called here a transnational atlas for Palestinian literature. The good news is that it's open access for everyone. And the other good news is because it's open access and internet based, it has all the interviews and the data and everything there in it. And it's a massively important, and it it basically focuses on journals, magazines in which Palestinians wrote wherever they are. They happen to be in Latin America or in the Arab world and so on. And I thought I had the, oh yeah, it's the top there, but it's not showing on my screen. To actually play a little bit. I can't see it. I can't see it on my screen, but I see it there, maybe because I have a lot of clutter on my screen. I don't know how to do it. Yeah, I basically need just to get to the yeah, it's a top here. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. All right, so let's see. If the internet is good. We should be able to actually look at it. And I just wanted us to look at it very briefly. So this is the book. And something. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So I'm going to do it just for 5 minutes. Yeah. So we enter it. I mean, it's organized chronologically, but some of the things in it, lots of goodie bags in this. So let's say really pictures and highlights the things that are actually discussed, and it has, as I said, audio-visual element. Well, let's see what Khalil Gibran have anything to do with it. So let the disposal post Nakba. That's Faisal Daraj, a critic, talking about there. But that's just one example of how to navigate things. I think a librarian would be very happy to see this as open access. So, so I wanted to, I mean, now we have this. I just wanted to go back to actually, where does that title come from? Country of Words. So I'm going to leave this and return to my screen.
Salah, I worked on the project. It comes from a Mahmoud Darwish poem.
Well, you revealed my next slide. I just said I wanted to show you where it comes from. So I just said that. Okay. So it comes from this poem. Zainab, we may be able to come. If you have something really urgent to say, Zainab al-Qaisi, you have a hand. I don't want to bypass you. Do you want to say something?
Actually, you're just waiting for you to open access for us to participate on the Country of Words. I just wanted to leave a few words on the website of Rifqa, but we can leave my.
Okay, so yeah, people are going to have access to this. So, but if you think something they should know, we're happy to pass the knowledge on. That's one purpose of this seminar. Yeah. Okay, so there's this poem that I put again the English version here, and it's called "We Travel Like Other People." And you'll see it has echoes from all the slides that we discussed, including Edward Said at the beginning. I will not read the Arabic. We'll look at it here and talk about it a little bit together, and then I conclude. There are multiple translations of this poem, and it has more or less, students who Dervish would know, there are a number of metaphors keep coming, a number of figures, a number of images that keep coming, but the end of it is what interests me here, and that's where the title comes from, as Ruth told us. لنا بلد من كلام, but we have this country of words. But the main thing is to actually keep talking. And talking could be here understood, keep writing, keep doing, keep speaking. And you see a lot these days, keep talking about Palestine, keep talking about this. But he has this ending there, which is very unlike what Edward Said does, which is let's speak so that may end this journey, that speaking itself one day. And those of you who followed their seminars, remember how much emphasis there was about the language. That actually, the whole idea is you can dispossess me of land, but I can probably handle that in that sense. But language and owning it is the most important one, who owns it and who plays with it. And I think this poem brings us back, in a sense, to where we started. So how literature, in a sense, has the capacity to make what may be local or historically insignificant part of a shared memory. How literature itself can act as a form of collective remembering. There's the active voice there, but also a collective construction of the self and of the nation, as we saw a number of examples. So in this sense, Palestine is a nation of words, as Dervish put it. And this is why, for him or for many, the last frontier, or perhaps the last line of defense, is actually language, when the land is a remote possibility, if any at all. But not a specific language, let's say Arabic or French or English, but actually a language of one's own, a decolonized language free, feels free to name the loss, to name the pain, and to name the hope. And that, I think, we could end here. I hope this series contribute to some kind of sharing some knowledge and allowing us to imagine these realities that most of us do not necessarily inhabit. I don't know where I'm going to take this series next, or if at all, but I would welcome suggestions. And I thank you all for following this and participating in making this some sort of community of ideas and shared literature. His one thought is to actually continue the series as conversations with, so we can invite actually practitioners of literature or literary creatives, and then actually have conversation with them. And they don't have to be here, could do that online. Okay, well, thank you very much, and keep reading.